Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Turin here with another Warhammer Total War online commentary. In this particular battle, I'll be playing Bretonnia, and I'm going to be facing off against the nefarious vampire counts led by Vlad von Karstein, so it should be fun. So as far as my army composition goes, I do have King LOUEN over here. I also have two paladins, and then I have a damsel somewhere. I usually keep my damsel with my mobile force, because if I kind of send them on a far recon mission, or I'm trying to circumvent my opponent's army, kind of catch their cav out of position, I like to have her there to make sure they are most certainly in range of her buffs. So with her, I do have Harmonic Convergence, as well as the Curse of the Midnight Wind, which are both very, very good in that tight cav engagement. I also have a front line of the Men-at-Arms with polearms, which are essentially a Swiss Army knife. They're definitely one of my favorite infantry in the game. They have 40 melee defense, which is extremely high for how much you're paying. They have armor piercing, and they also have an anti-large bonus. So against a lot of, vampire count units, whether it be, crypt horrors or, any of their heroic units, white kings or, anything, they're going to have a pretty good anti-large bonus. And Blood Knights are somewhat popular in this matchup. I haven't been seeing them as much lately, but still they're pretty scary, and, Men-at-Arms with polearms can hold their own against them. And also another huge perk is they have a charge defense against all, which is just great. So definitely a very, very good utility unit, in my opinion. I also have two groups of peasant bowmen to target mortis engines and other high value units, and then in the back I have one more group of men-at-arms with polearms to support. So that's pretty much it for my army, and also of course the two Grail Knights, as you guys saw. As far as my opponent's army goes, he has a front line of skeletons mixed in with Graveguard, which is very smart. They're all armored, and well, skeletons aren't armored, but they're shielded. The Graveguard are armored and shielded, so very resilient against the peasant force. And Bretonnian infantry are pretty low in terms of their defensive stats, aside from the melee defense. I'm just talking in regards to their armor. So having these anti-infantry Graveguard here are going to be pretty good in this matchup. He also has Vlad von Karstein. He has a Necromancer. He has several groups of skeletons in the back line, so pretty heavy infantry core, and he'll have that perpetual regeneration from these units. And it looks like with Vlad, he brought Van Hell's Dance Macabre, and he also brought, of course, Invocation of Nehek. So very smart. And Vlad, of course, comes with the Master of Bagamut, which is really good against a group of Grail Knights or King LOUEN or any of those other type of units. And for any of you who don't know, it's a debuff that he has that immediately lowers the melee attack of a unit by, I believe, 46 or 48, which is pretty good, and it lasts actually quite long. So he also has a Vargulf back here, which is very rare. You don't see these guys terribly often, but it is armor piercing, and it does have regeneration. So if you can keep it alive and keep it from being focused, I suppose it can be good. Personally, I don't think it's the best investment. And then, of course, he does have a Vampire back here with a pretty interesting build. So with the Vampire, he actually has Soul Blight and Doom and Darkness, or I think that's aspect of the Dread Knight. So it's going to essentially be pretty good in his front line to kind of rout off my peasants. He can use the Doom and Darkness and the Soul Blight to essentially just kind of mass rout my center line, hopefully in an ideal world, and pretty interesting synergy between the Lore of Death and Lore of Vampires there. Then, of course, he has a group of Blood Knights, and that's pretty much it, and there's a White King there as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, guys. It should be a fun one. Fairly unique army composition from our Vampire Count's opponent here, so we will see how the forces of Bretonnia handle it. So I immediately advance out with my Grail Knights. I always like to kind of just posture up and, make my opponent feel a little bit uncomfortable. So I just essentially wanted to get around his forces here and try and goad these Blood Knights into combat. Because a lot of people underestimate the power of Grail Knights, especially when it synergizes with King LOUEN and the Curse of the Midnight Wind. Even a very high tier group of Blood Knights is going to have a lot of trouble in that matchup. So I'm trying to bait him in, and it looks like he's kind of coming out here, but we haven't gotten any confirmation of commitment yet, because he's keeping pretty high and tight, which is very smart. Because he has the Skeleton Spearman here, and that's something I like to do with Vampire Counts against Bretonnia, is kind of keep it high and tight and use Skeleton Spearman to protect your peripheries. And if you do that, it's pretty hard to find a place for these Grail Knights, to be honest. A lot of times you just ride around trying to pick a battle, and then their infantry will just get there and run you over. So pretty good play there by my opponent. So you can see the Graveguard are taking the missile fire from the Peasant Bowman, but really there's not a lot of great targets for that either. Probably one of the best targets would be the Vargulf once it gets in range, or these Blood Knights over here, but he's staying just out of range there. So fortunately I'm having to focus these guys down. And one thing that actually works pretty well with Grail Knights is a lot of people don't consider it, but they can actually ride right up the pipe and support your men-at-arms. That's another use I'd like to use them for. But these are actually skeleton warriors here, but I believe he does have the spearman in the flank, so I don't know if I got that wrong earlier. But you can see in the front line, the Graveguard and skeletons are going to engage with the peasants here. It should be a pretty good battle for me. The melee defense of these guys is pretty high, and they do have armor piercing. And you can see I use the Harmonic Convergence to give them melee attack as well as melee defense. They're going to do a pretty good job holding these guys for quite some time. So over here, my Goon Squad's coming around, and I was trying to find a place for my Grail Knights to go, and he was keeping these guys pretty high and tight, and you can see he literally had them stacked on top of the Spearmen. So there was nothing I could do there in regards to taking them out. So I'm like, all right, screw it. Let's just go right down the pipe, and it'll help with this Vargulf. So Grail Knights are going to get in there and support the peasants. Definitely a little uncommon in terms of Bretonnian tacticianship, helping those peasants out, but they're getting in there and doing pretty good. And I also use a Curse of the Midnight Wind to get some really big value on all these units. And you can see the Vargulf starting to take a little bit of damage, and so is infantry. And at the same time, I do detach a group of men-at-arms here, and he did use a Soul Blight, so you can see a lot of my peasants are actually still eager because there are lords nearby, and yeah, there's a lot of support. So I detach a group of these men-at-arms here to intercept these guys, which is pretty essential. If I hadn't done that, it would have probably just been a mass punishment in the back line, but unfortunately my peasant bowmen are a little out of position. But on that same note, the Blood Knights are kind of wrapped up here with these men-at-arms, so it's not a terrible situation. And you can see the Grail Knights are putting that Vargulf down just a little bit, doing quite a bit of damage. And over here, the Grave Guard and other units are starting to take a beating, because unfortunately for them, King LOUEN was diving in and doing quite a bit of damage, and I actually did a little bit of a bombing run on Vlad here and was able to do some pretty substantial HP damage. And these paladins, also with the Potion of Foolhardiness and the Potion of Toughness, are going to last quite some time here in the melee line, especially considering Vlad doesn't have your heavy-duty armor piercing that, like an Ungrim or a Grimgor would have, so he should be fine for quite some time here. You can see he's in pretty good health, but he is shaken. So in the back line, I do bring King LOUEN because I knew this was very important. I wanted to keep my peasant bowmen alive, and so I do detach that group of Grail Knights from the front line. I keep one in there fighting, and I bring the other one back to help out with this White King and kind of this mass blob back here, so it's definitely very scary. Thankfully for me, this group of peasant bowmen was able to kind of detach from that madness and is now focused firing the Blood Knights there, so a very, very good situation for me. But on that same note, my opponent detaches a group of skeletons and is able to kind of run past and start pressuring, so I'm going to have to retreat these peasants here shortly. But having King LOUEN here against these low-tier skeletons, they're going to start to crumble pretty quickly. He's a pretty substantial force to be reckoned with, and you can see with the Curse of the Midnight Wind and the Sword of Corone, which I've kind of been cycling perpetually, they're doing a pretty good job. And these are actually skeleton spearmen here, but thankfully my Grail Knights aren't isolated against them because they actually do have an anti-large bonus. So, considering they are really low tier, with that anti-large bonus, they can actually do a little bit of damage to the Grail Knights. But the men-at-arms are here protecting them, and they do have to stand your ground from King LOUEN, so that's a pretty good situation. Over here, the Grail Knights are trying to slay the Foul Beast. The Vargulf did get the Invocation of Nehek, but Vlad is also here, so this is a very, very important point of the battle. You can see my opponent has a lot of resources focused here, but thankfully these men-at-arms are just holding strong. They're not giving any ground, and especially when supported by these Grail Knights here, they're doing a pretty darn good job. I'm very, very happy with their performance this game. You can see this Paladin that I mentioned earlier was able to use the potion and was actually able to do pretty good, and you can see King LOUEN was able to kind of free up the back line. You can see my peasant bowmen were able to escape, and I was able to kind of punish those skeletons that were chasing those peasants. So now they're just going to fire in and have free range on these Blood Knights back here. So I was very happy about that. And also the damsel back here getting in there with her pimp cane. And you can see King LOUEN. They do have Vlad relatively isolated, so this is a really good situation because King LOUEN is undoubtedly one of the strongest duelists in the game. So having him on Vlad is going to be very bad. And I'm not sure if my opponent already used his Master of Beguilement. If I'm not mistaken, he did use it on the Grail Knight, so he doesn't have it right now. And you can see Vlad with that minus 15 armor and minus 36 melee defense is battling King LOUEN, and he might go down here shortly. Even though Vlad is very, very strong, having those debuffs, especially if King LOUEN just pick him up, I think he did. Man, I wonder if that's going to kill him. That was a pretty cool way for Vlad to go, for sure, just to be swooped up in the sky by Beakus here and just drop to his death. So that was pretty good, and vampire accounts definitely suffer a lot from leadership. Most of their skeletons and Graveguard, they only have between 30 and 50 leadership, so when their lord dies, it's pretty devastating. So back here you can see the Grail Knights are kind of cleaning up shop. A lot of those troops crumble right in front of their eyes, and the Vargulf here definitely got slayed by the peasants. You can see he's standing here triumphantly, so very, very cool. Raising his halberd or polearm for Harambe, so pretty sweet. But I do have some peasant bowmen here back in the back line. They're actually still shaken despite that battle being won, but there are still a few groups of Graveguard, and of course I'm sure the Sternsmen are lurking around here somewhere. This White King is one of the last pockets of resistance, but everything at this point is crumbling. So very, very well played game. It was a lot of fun, and thankfully we were able to get Vlad there at the end. It got pretty wild when he got through my back line, but the peasants held up, and the Grail Knights were able to plug in. Normally I like to use Grail Knights to cycle charge and pressure a lot, but I felt like there was so much committed in that center point that I didn't mind leaving them there for a while and then pulling that second group out to come and kind of help secure the back line. That's a very important mechanic with Bretonnia, is kind of keeping the peasant bowman line firing, because they generate so much value for how little you're paying into them. So if you can keep them firing, they can really focus down Blood Knights and Vargulfs and all those type of units. So very, very well played to my opponent, Empty. I don't really know how you would enunciate the rest of that name, but very, very well played there. You can see the Graveguard racked up some kills, but the Vargulf it's a tricky unit to find a home for. Personally, I like experimenting with it and trying it out, but I haven't had much success with it yet. But I thought it was a pretty cool synergy with the lore of vampires to use the fear mechanic to rout off the peasants, but you can see the peasants maintained their health pretty well, racked up a ton of kills. Granted, those were mostly against skeletons, but the Grail Knights did good, and of course King LOUEN was pimping it as usual. So very well played against my opponent. Look forward to seeing you again on ladder, and I hope you guys enjoyed that Bretonian cast. Have an excellent night, and take care.